The Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association is proud to support BIV's daily Coping with COVID podcast series. And now that there is a plan to safely restart BC, we hope you'll join us in supporting your favorite local businesses. From restaurants to retail, our downtown businesses need us now more than ever. Thanks, everyone, and stay safe.
Hi, I'm Tyler Orton, and before we get to today's interview, here are some of the top stories we're following at Business in Vancouver. The Vancouver International Airport Authority has named a new CEO in Tamara Vrooman. She previously served as the CEO of Vancity Credit Union and will take over the new job effective July 1st. And regulators here in the province have given the nod to two more ride-hailing companies in British Columbia. Ripe Rides and Bonnie's Taxis are the 12th and 13th operators to be approved. That's it for now. Now for today's interview.
Welcome to BIB Daily and our daily Coping with COVID-19 podcast from Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, Editor-in-Chief and Publisher. It's become a cliche to pronounce that we're in these unprecedented times, but the latest job figures in British Columbia and Canada really lend credence to that. In the space of 2 months, the pandemic has created this crisis that is unprecedented. It's wiped out 14 years of job growth in a matter of 2 short months. And young people, of course, are particularly hard hit. I want to look at the data today and the implications with Ken Peacock. He's the Chief Economist and the Vice President of the Business Council of British Columbia. Glad to have you with us from isolation. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me, Kirk.
You looking pretty safe? Looking pretty healthy?
I'm feeling safe. I'm okay here.
Can't say the same thing, though, about the jobs numbers. These are really just an amazing turnaround in our economy. Yeah. Walk us through a little bit of the high points, or I guess they're low points, if you want to call it that, of what we've seen in the last couple of months.
Sure. Well, let's just take your listeners back a moment to the March labor force survey results. And in March, the thing about the March survey is Statistics Canada, was in the field in the sort of third week of March. And that was kind of around the same time that the closures came. So we didn't think that March was going to capture the full impact. Nevertheless, there was 132,000 jobs that it did capture. Yeah. We suspected that April would see a somewhat larger job decline just because it would capture the full effect of the closures in the April survey. And sure enough, we did see a bigger number, but it doubled from March. So we went to 264,000. So by coincidence, it exactly doubled. Add those two figures together and you're up to pretty close to 400,000, which you were talking about. I mean, extraordinary, mind-boggling numbers. We should not get too far ahead of ourselves. Some of these jobs will come back, and that's really the question looking forward, Kirk. But in the meantime, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can dice this, and there's a lot of pain in the job market.
Well, what it also says is that businesses, in a way, were, I don't know, it sounds as if they were anticipating that there was going to come a point where they were going to have to call it off for a bit and really start laying people off, shuttering their businesses and all that. It seemed to happen all in that one, 7-day period where people just said, that's it, turn the lights off.
Yep. Well, I guess they were mandated. So many businesses and operations were mandated to close. Yep. So they literally shut it down. And I mean, so much has happened in the past 6 weeks, but I remember just hearing stories about managers who were laying off dozens and dozens and, 50, 100 people, like you said, literally overnight. And here we are, 6, 7 weeks later, and that is exactly what the numbers are suggesting, mass layoffs.
Can you characterize the cohorts that were really hardest hit? We talk about young people in all of this because many of them, of course, were the juniors in a lot of their outfits. They were, in some cases, in service sector, parts of the economy that were going to be really hard hit in a hurry. So is the impact, ostensibly a young person one?
It's a great question. There's a couple dimensions that are worth teasing out and talking about. One of them is, and it's not surprising, that this is really a private sector phenomena. If you look at that total 400,000 job loss number, 388,000 were private sector jobs. So it really is about the private sector. Yes, there's been pain in the public sector. Some cities have had to lay off workers with park closures and whatnot. And they've seen a big hit in what would be normal times, but compared to what we're seeing in the private sector, the public sector is relatively unscathed. So I think that's the first point to keep in mind. If we're going to get these jobs back, it's going to come through private sector job growth, companies rehiring, but also it's going to require new jobs being created because we're not getting all these jobs back. But I think to get more directly to what you were talking about age cohorts, the 15 to 24 year age group, especially hard hit. But job losses are spread right across the age spectrum. The thing that was kind of interesting about the April report is the number of losses in the 25 to 54 age group, that sort of core working age, actually tripled. So there was a big surge in those numbers, whether they were a little more senior or whether it was other industries that caught up sort of the second month, not clear, but they did triple. But if you look at it in terms of proportions, like percent decreases, it really is that 15 to 24 year age cohort. 25% decline in the number of people working between the ages of 15 and 24. So 1 in 4 jobs for young people, Kirk, have been eliminated. The unemployment rate has surged to 25%. So this is something that policymakers really do need to pay attention to.
Yeah, well, let's skip right away into some of the implications of this because, I'm old enough to remember the recession back in '82. I certainly saw a lot of things happen in 2008, even '87. I guess there was a bit of a meltdown on the stock market. You could see some job losses there, but nothing like this, of course, has happened to us. Are we in danger of having essentially a lost generation here around employment?
Yeah, this is the big concern. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is something we're talking about sort of almost every day at the Business Council, just because of exactly what you're talking about. If the job recovery process is very slow, and I mean, keep in mind, think about the university people who are graduating this year, maybe graduating next year, depending on how slow this thing is. High school students coming into the labor market. We still have immigrants coming into the country at some point. All these people are going to need jobs, and there is definitely a real risk if the recovery is slow that there will be scarring and damage. So the literature is very clear on this. Long-term unemployment is very scarring and very damaging. And it's difficult at this stage just to know how much we should be worried. It's the Great Recession or the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. We saw total employment in BC fall by about 70,000 people over a 9-month period. Keep in mind, we just saw 400,000 jobs disappear in 2 months. It took about 4 years, not quite 4 years, to regain employment to the pre-recession levels back in 2008, 2009. I think we're looking at a much deeper hole than 70,000, even if we get a pretty reasonable snapback. Say we get half the jobs back, 200,000 jobs by the end of the year. We're going to be starting from a position of at least 200,000 to 300,000 jobs in the hole. To me, that's more than a 4-year recovery. So this is something to be worried about.
What is there to be done, do you think, here, Ken? I mean, this is ironically probably the best educated jobless cohort we've ever had in society. Do we try to encourage young people to go back to school and support them through that? Do we keep them on some kind of income support program to get them through this? What is it? Because it's not like these jobs just simply manifest themselves again. In a lot of cases, you're dealing with employers that are also really hard struck, and they can't hold on to almost anybody, much less the young people they've got.
No, this is exactly the problem. I think your first point is absolutely going to be important. We're going to need to see education and training. I think it's some young people will look at this as a bit of an opportunity. a chance to kind of reset and retrain because they may have lost their job, and that particular job that they lost is not coming back. So I think absolutely training, education. It's going to require employers to communicate with post-secondary education institutions to try and coordinate what kind of programs they need to get people into the workforce more quickly. And I think we're going to have to look at over the next few years here, just kind of streamlining some of the programs that are in place, if they can be sped up to get people trained and up to speed more quickly. But the critical issue is, like you were alluding to, there's going to need to be jobs for these people to flow into. So we're going to need to create the conditions here for two key things. Get as many of these jobs back as possible, but I think it's got to be important to understand government is not going to be able to save every job. The federal government is doing what it can. It's rolling out wage subsidy programs. There's rent subsidy programs or rent relief, loans and whatnot. They're doing extraordinary measures, but it's just not going to be able to save every employer. So save the ones we can, get them to rehire as many people they can, but then we have to turn our attention to growing firms, growing new firms, and creating new job opportunities. And I think that comes through, Kirk, just kind of struggling and fighting for every job we can get, creating good conditions here. It's not a time to be raising taxes. It's not a time to be increasing regulatory burden at all.
Yeah, I haven't got it on my desk, Ken, but it wasn't so long ago that you and I were talking about the council's own reporting on this, about the lack of competitiveness in the British Columbian economy, and how while the indices were all very nice and we appear to be leading Canada in job growth and GDP, and in fact we were probably highly placed in all of North America, we still had conditions that were uncompetitive for business. Yeah. So as we try to untangle all of this mess, and we try to position ourselves better so that as we grow optimally back, are there particular things that you can point to where governments are going to have to forego the revenue grab, or forego the delay in processing, or forego a little bit of its own behavior in order to make sure that actually businesses have a responsible freedom to grow?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. How I'm trying to kind of conceptualize this, and we're in this new territory, uncharted waters, whatever term you want to use. So I find myself constantly looking for kind of frameworks and ways to approach this issue. And what I'm thinking in terms of this recovery is there. In the very near term and in the immediate here, do no more harm. So let's not proceed with additional regulatory processes. Let's not create new items. Those should all be on hold. We are doing fine in terms of making sure everything gets done in a proper manner. So let's not make that more complicated. And by extension, let's not add any additional cost to business. Freeze on that. I find it a little frustrating when you see the federal government doing something like the federal wage subsidy program, but then in the same time in the provincial realm, there's a tax going up, or there's a tax is going to increase in the near term. So let's not have these policies at odds with one another, at least in the immediate term. Once we get through that, then we'll turn to rebuilding. Yeah.
I mean, I should ask you a little bit about the new LEAF program that the federal government unfurled. It's still sketchy in terms of details, but there seem to be a few add-ons here to businesses, a few accountability measures in order to tap into these funds that bridge them presumably to some kind of recovery. What I wonder about in all of this is again, the behavioral history that public sector will have, which is that they want to kind of solve a lot of problems at once. And one of the things that we appear to be trying to do is to skip into trying to solve the climate crisis. We're trying to solve a lot of other issues involving executive compensation or governance, those types of things. And by tying measures to companies and saying, as you apply for your funds, you'd also better be prepared to come forward with these types of things. I'm not looking for letting business off the leash entirely, but But is there a responsible way for governments to act? As you say, do no more harm, but also like don't try to rewrite some rules while businesses actually need the support.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree. And the example you're citing, excuse me, is a perfect one, because that LEAF program, I mean, it's intended to be sort of a lender of last resort. So it's for larger companies that have already exhausted other options for securing financing to get them through this. So clearly they're facing challenges. And then as part of the program, the federal government is imposing this requirement that they report out on how they're going to address their climate change targets and goals and whatnot. Those are very important objectives. Absolutely get that. But it just might not be the time to say you're only going to get this money that you clearly desperately need because we are the lender of last resort. Oh, and by the way, you've got to do this additional burden process. Who knows how long it takes before, or agree to do it in the future before you're going to get this lending. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of complexity I don't think we need at this time.
Yeah. I mean, and not to beat up the public sector any further here, but one more question on this. You pointed to the fact that the public sector job losses were relatively small compared to, of course, the private sector ones. But at some point, the public sector requires the public sector to provide this revenue. In order to keep it so going. So are we kind of lurching toward the inevitable here, where there'll be one of two choices: either federal and provincial and municipal governments will have to do some dramatic service cuts in order to meet their revenue targets, or are going to have to come back with some kind of new income measures around taxation. To basically drive the train so that they're not into absurd levels of deficits.
Yeah, so you're getting into, I guess the question is, at what point do governments pivot and become more concerned about deficits and start to address the reality that will one day show up in the not too distant future, that these deficits have to start to be paid down or at least addressed and get under control. I think the mindset right now is we're not worried about deficits, which is probably the right approach given the job destruction that we have seen. But absolutely, the revenue is going to have to come from the private sector. I think you're going to see in the next year or two, of course, the role of the public sector expand within the economy, just by definition, because we've lost so many private sector jobs. But government's also going to be looking to do more programs and whatnot. But we're going to need the private sector to grow to provide the revenue and finances. And I'm speculating a little bit here, but if one looks out 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, there's going to be pressure for additional revenue. Governments are going to be looking to increase taxes almost invariably, unless we see really strong economic growth coming out the other side of this thing, say a couple of years from now. If the economy really rebounds, that can juice government revenues too. So the search might not be as intense, but generally speaking, when I look out, I see upward pressure for taxes in the future.
I think Canadians have been generally quite supportive of what senior levels of government have been able to do in terms of significant forms of support for income and for wages and obviously in lending money to businesses and all that. I think that the data is evident that the government's getting high marks. We don't feel the same thing about the United States. Right? We think the United States is a bit of a hot mess. But we can't afford to have the United States be a hot mess, can we?
No, we cannot. And I guess I'll jump in and run with what you're hinting at. This is part of the challenge with this recession that is now being created. It's clear we're in recession here, but we have to start turning our minds to the reality that the global economy is in recession and the U.S. economy is in recession. So this is the thing that's kind of complicated this crisis from the beginning. Is the lockdown kind of imposed immediate downturn in the consumer spending part of the economy. But now we're going to be struggling. As we gradually reopen, we're going to be struggling with kind of mixed conditions in the consumer spending part of the economy, while we're also dealing with the challenge of a fairly significant global recession. So this is why this thing is going to drag out for quite some time, Kirk, is exactly what you're alluding to. And the U.S. in particular is a big trading and important trading partner for us.
Is that also, do you think, a little bit behind why Canada is not speaking very aggressively about, first of all, about America from a national perspective, and about China? That these are trading partners we need, and we need them to be as healthy as they possibly can be. And this is not the time to necessarily be rattling their cages.
And you probably I think that's a fair observation. That's a good observation. Not the time to be rattling their cages, and it's not the time to get into some sort of escalating trade war. And the other day I saw that China imposed some fairly punitive tariffs. I think it was on Australian barley in response to some Australian comments around the source of the virus and some concerns and the desire to look into that. So, yeah, when I see that, I do get concerned, because we really don't need to see tariffs slapped on and then retaliatory tariffs on top of the challenges that the global economy is currently facing. And I mean, when you look at the air travel space and the tourism industry, it really does suggest that the global economy is going to face challenges for quite some time.
Yeah. I want to take it back to the local level for our last question. It has to do with, I mean, there you are in your home, and I think most people who would be watching this today would likely be working remotely in all of this. What do you think are some of the medium-term consequences for our economy with having so much work now remotely conducted? I mean, we have as a country, I think, a productivity issue anyway. Are we going to see ourselves even far less productive and competitive as a result of the fact that many of us are not going back into our places of work?
That's a good question. It's very mixed. We did have productivity challenges. We do have productivity challenges both in BC and Canada. Coming out of this, I would almost expect productivity to improve, but that's because you're pushing to get as much output as you can from fewer workers. So there may be a productivity improvement. Difficult to say, though. At the same time, you look around what's going on in the retail space right now. There's now a couple security guards at the door. There's people, managing lineups. So if that model kind of is what happens right across retail, that's going to hurt productivity numbers because you got more employees per unit of sale or whatnot. But the working from home thing, I'm finding, and I'm talking to people that also find, they say it has definite productive benefits. You lose the benefit of going to the office and the camaraderie and the talk that goes on, but it's very efficient to get to meetings. This conversation that we're having, we click a button, we start it. I don't have to go into the studio anymore. So there are some efficiency gains. I'm not sure how exactly this is going to shake out, to be entirely honest.
Yeah. And the last point on this one, we do talk, and I think it was last week that we had mental health awareness, information out there. When you take a look again at that kind of that area of what is our productivity, our outlook, our overall activity overall, and does this isolation and seclusion from a workplace, a workforce, your colleagues, physically, does it? Do you think eventually have some data points that start to illustrate a kind of a decline around how it is that we're generating economic activity, if we the impact on our mental health and the intersection with it?
Well, we're getting outside the realm of any expertise on my behalf here, but I mean, I can just speak to the potential impact and implications for the economy, sure. mental health, I think, is going to be a growing concern. It already is a big challenge in our society. People, awareness is increasing, but it's a huge issue. And I think what's going on here is going to have significant implications for mental health. I mean, I just look around a few friends and my household here. I find sometimes people are good. The day is going good, but then there's these moments where they're like, I'm going a little crazy, a little stir crazy, need to get out and talk to people. I think we're going to probably find office workers finding some sort of balance between going in a few times, and then I think some of this working at home is going to stick. People have realized there are advantages to it. You save a little bit of money and you save a lot of time. But we also do have to remember there are a whole bunch of workers that aren't in the fortunate position of being able to work from home. So that's one of the reasons that as we go forward here, as many people that do have the luxury from working from home are going to have to continue to do so, keep space open for those who don't have that opportunity. But back to the mental health concerns. They are big, they are significant. It links back to what we opened the conversation with, Kirk, this long-term unemployment and the erosion of skills that happens, and mental health, seclusion, isolation really is a concern. And when we have 25% youth unemployment and 11-12% overall unemployment rate, if that doesn't go down relatively quickly, we are going to face significant challenges in society.
Well, then I'll squeeze in one last question, which is that a lot of the federal support has now started to flow into businesses this month, and that we're really seeing, obviously wage subsidies come in, employers being encouraged heavily to bring people back. Are you somewhat confident that the next wave of jobless numbers will soften a touch?
I actually am. I've been thinking about this since Friday when we saw that horrific report. And with the reopening that's been announced, and though, I mean, I do have to say it's great to take the opportunity. BC has done an extraordinary job. We have done well. We have managed this crisis. Our experts, Dr. Bonnie Henry, has just been miraculous in managing this. And so I think our reopening is going to go relatively well compared to other jurisdictions. Keep in mind, we never shut down the construction industry. Right. Other provinces, Quebec and Ontario did. That's a big hit. So as we return to this gradual reopening, we didn't have the destruction in some sectors that other provinces has dealt with. I think we are going to see, I'm kind of torn between another downward move. I don't think it's going to be in the 100,000s again. Maybe just some additional layoffs, some other businesses that are noticing the spillover impacts. Going to see some layoffs there. But when you reopen retail, even if it's at half capacity, you're rehiring a lot of people, and there's big hits in retail and there's big hits in the food and accommodation sector. You're not going to see jobs come back into the accommodation sector, but clearly in the restaurant industry, even under some partial reopening, there's going to be rehiring. So it is entirely possible that next month's job report will actually see a little bit of an increase, or even a 30 or 40,000 bump. I would hope that's the case. So I'm kind of between minus 40,000 and plus 40,000. That's not exactly a very specific forecast, but that's kind of the area or realm I'm thinking.
Well, let's hope for better times ahead. We know that we've probably hit quite a trough here for a while. Ken, always good to talk to you. Thanks a lot for your help today.
Thanks, Kirk. Good talking to you.
Ken Peacock is the Chief Economist, Vice President of the Business Council of British Columbia. You've been watching Coping with COVID, the BIV Daily podcast. I'm Kirk LaPointe. Thanks a lot for watching.